Hello and welcome to the debate. I'm your host, Maqbool, with you at PTV World, of course, with my two in-house analysts, Farrukh, Pitafi and Faisal. We'll be talking more to them about, of course, what is going to be the topic of discussion today, the caretaker setup and, of course, the upcoming general elections. This is important, especially in terms of the kind of developments that we've seen in the past and the fact that we still do not have a name yet. There is, of course, the planned consultation with leader of the opposition, but it's also important to note whether or not the different political parties themselves have reached a consensus, and then moving forward, will that be achieved with the opposition as well, and whether or not we're going to be seeing somebody coming up whose name is unanimously agreed upon by the different sections. It's important also in terms of the consequences that this will have as to the time frame of the caretaker setup and who's going to be leading the House in the challenging political and economic times that the country and the caretaker setup will likely face in the time period ahead. We also, of course, know that the new census results have been ratified in the CCI, and because of that, the delimitations are in order. And since that is happening, there is, of course, a delay in the elections, something which has been pointed towards March next year by the Interior Minister and others. This is important, especially in the kind of timeline that is required to conduct the general elections, the responsibility of which is being put on the ECP. And this is important in terms of whether or not the time frame till March 2024 is going to be enough for that, and whether or not that is a certainty for the elections to take place, and of course for the political parties to act accordingly, and if we're going to be able to see any possible delay in this entire procedure. At the same time, we're also going to be taking a look at what this means for the different political parties and their campaign, especially in terms of the consequences of the new delimitations and how exactly will the different political parties be able to navigate through that. And then moving forward also in terms of the kind of free and fair elections that are required in the country based on the new census, whether the caretaker setup will be up to the task, who's going to be leading that setup, and also, of course, in terms of the very important standby arrangement with the IMF. So a number of challenges, of course, exist ahead. But the good news, of course, is that we are moving in the right direction in terms of the dissolution of assemblies, as spoken earlier and reiterated and reassured by the ruling elite many times in the past, the summary of which is going to be sent today to the president, and we are expecting that they will be dissolved before midnight tonight. And so we're going to be taking a look at what that means in terms of the kind of contribution it puts towards the democratic process, and whether or not moving ahead there are going to be any rifts that can possibly exist between the previous alliances of the political parties. So we're going to be talking more about this with, of course, Farrukh and Faisal in the studios. We've also been joined online by Barrister Shabbir, Advocate, Supreme Court of Pakistan. Thank you very much, Barrister Sahab, for being with us and being part of the discussion. And let me start with you, especially in terms of the kind of expectation that one would have towards what is going to happen next. Of course, the dissolution of assemblies is welcome, but in terms of the kind of consensus that we were hoping for, we still really haven't seen a name. And of course, we're very close to the dissolution of assemblies, and we understand that there is a procedure involved in terms of when there is no consensus, how the parliamentary committee is then, of course, something that takes over, and then the ECP. But I also want to understand that while that is happening, what sort of setup continues to exist and who continues to be in charge, and whether or not there can be, there has to be a finite amount of time in which a name has to come up in the absence of a consensus.
Is the question posed to me, Sana?
Yes.
Okay. So you see, there's no surprise. Article 224 of the Constitution regulates this specifically, and it provides for a caretaker setup. It also regulates that how is it that a caretaker prime minister or the chief minister is to be appointed, in how many days to be precise, and the tenure of the caretaker government also, both in terms of a dissolution and so also when the assembly expires, its assembly completes its tenure. So we start with your first question, which is that how many days do we have, or the Constitution provides, until and unless the prime minister or the chief minister in this case is to be appointed. I think, to be precise, from the date the assembly is dissolved, there is a total number of 8 days. 3 days from the first day for the prime minister and the leader of the opposition. And when I say prime minister, reference could also be taken to mean as the chief minister or vice versa. So first 3 days, and then if the prime minister and the leader of the opposition they don't come up with a name, there is no consensus, then another 3 days for a committee to be constituted, four members from the ruling side and four from the opposition. They also have 3 days. If they also don't come up with any decision, then the Election Commission of Pakistan in the next 2 days. So a total of 8 days with three different steps. Uh, I
Right,
having
and there is
experienced
no
this.
possibility of these of any extension beyond these 8 days. So that can't happen.
Well, well, looking at the constitution, strictly speaking, there is none.
Okay.
But you see that there are possibilities in the Punjab government having continued much longer than the constitution has provided for. And also, your next question, which is also very relevant, is whether or not the caretaker government can continue till March. Constitutionally, there is no possibility. I mean, if you ask me, I'll come to it later, but that's a fraud on the constitution. But uh, um, but we come back to the first question, which is there are 8 days. So I have explained that the 8 days are divided in three different steps, one by one. It is such an important matter uh, that the Constitution has taken pains to decide and regulate specifically each and every step so that no room is left with the legislature कि कोई आम assemblies, you pass an act like the Elections Act 2023, and if you wanted to modify this, you cannot modify this because the Constitution considered it so important that these dates are specifically stated therein, directly regulated by the Constitution. So there can be no amendment to this or no change of plans, no deviations unless there is a constitutional amendment itself. So that is the first point. Can you remind me of the second question that
Right,
you asked?
right. I'll do that, and also add to the first part whether or not there is any sort of, again, I want to reiterate, any sort of provision or any sort of aspect that can be taken under perhaps say unforeseen circumstances or any case of emergency perhaps in which these 8 days will then be able to be navigated around. And second question was that while the decision is being taken, who's in charge?
Your first question is far more important. You see, democracy is the basic and fundamental principle, or in other words, is the basic structure of our constitution. And there is no surprise there. Even if a constitutional amendment was to be made, we cannot change that part, which is that we are, end of the day, a democratic republic. Once we've said that, then the concept of a caretaker government, as defined by the word itself, that it is only coming as a stopgap arrangement and they are selected, they are not elected. Therefore, they are to stay for how many days? The answer, I don't have an answer, nobody else has an answer, but the Constitution has an answer that they are only to stay for X number of days. There cannot be any deviation. So, to me, if even an act is passed, even an executive order is issued, it would be without any lawful authority. It would be like tomorrow if you ask me a question that, sir, can martial law be imposed if there is an emergency? The answer would be, practically speaking, yes, it can be imposed, but what is the legal authority of a martial law? Absolutely not. It is unconstitutional. So, for the caretaker government to stay for even one more day is like the martial law is without lawful authority. Similarly, caretaker government would also be without lawful authority. Absolutely no basis, no two ways about it.
Yeah, Barrister Shabbir, if we talk about the extraordinary situations, of course, Pakistan has been facing in terms of economy, Pakistan's economy, it was on the brink of default, and we know that the current government, it took control of it, and of course, we are seeing that it is on track now. But if we, in coming months, if we see that there is a sort of emergent kind of situation in which extraordinary situations are created, can we say that in extraordinary situations, extraordinary measures would be taken, and if the political parties, if they will be having any sort of disagreement to it, that a sort of 6 months or 8 months prolonged elections, they do not accept it, eventually they'll be going to Supreme Court or somewhere else, then can we say that Supreme Court would be the eventual place where everything would be decided about the constitutional matters?
Sir, you see, there is a maxim: when we are at war, the laws are silent. I don't think we are in a situation of war at present or any near time in future. Inshallah, Pakistan stays and Pakistan will stay. And God forbid, if there is any challenge, you see, the problem is that I see your point. It would be a Machiavellian approach where you say that ends justify the means. So for the time being, we may have to take an illegal route because we are going to serve a greater cause. But history tells us whenever any institution, whether, and let me start from the Supreme Court of Pakistan, we have seen how Article 184.3 has been used, rather misused. And it was used so that whilst we normally don't have the power, we normally will not enter in the realm of the politics. But because for a greater cause, we want to use 184.3 because we have to save fundamental rights, and a question of public importance for saving fundamental rights has arisen. So what happened? You saw that the Supreme Court was virtually ruling the government, was running the government. So is the case with any other institution. So I don't think a Machiavellian approach or, in the larger good, such things have not served us well. I would see that as an unconstitutional act. And let the people decide. Eventually, you and I should decide who's going to decide, not the selected bunch. So, and secondly, sir, may I leave the floor? May I leave the floor with this question?
Yeah.
Why March then? Why not then December 2024? Why not then another 5 years? So if our finances, if our economy, God forbid, is not good enough until March, then who decides? The selected bunch who are here for 3 months, and the Constitution would have envisaged such a scenario, of course. So why March? Why not for another 2 years or 3 years or 4
Absolutely.
years?
And we'll talk more about that. And Farrukh, I want your take also on this, especially when we've spoken earlier about how you've spoken about doing away with caretaker setups altogether. And then, of course, in terms of the kind of empowerment that we've seen recently to the caretaker setup, there was, of course, the concern of the political and economic challenges. But I believe that the extension of the time period is not because of the economic challenges. It is, in fact, because of the new census results and the eventual delay because of that. And I want to understand whether or not the caretaker setup, as of now that we have, the system, the structure that we have, benefits from this empowerment rather than what you have earlier proposed about eventually in the future doing away with it altogether.
Right, Sana, and I'm grateful at this moment that Barrister Shabbir Shah actually spoke first, because while I was listening to him, it actually rang a bell. Today, if you have seen Pakistan channels, if you have been watching it for weeks, you will notice that everyone is talking about one office alone. That is the caretaker Prime Minister. What happens to the federating units and their heads? Have you seen any report as to who is going to be the caretaker Chief Minister of Sindh or Balochistan for that matter? Because the other two positions are already taken. Whether they are legal or not, that is another very different question that barristers have actually pointed out or raised. My question right now, and actually your question as well, it kind of reflects on the Constitution itself, or especially, courtesy our checkered history. that our constitution has become, a patchwork quilt, so to speak. I mean, dictators came, they added something else. The civilians came, they added something else. Then there were moments when one ideology clashed with the other, and we ended up incorporating all of those things in this constitution. 73's constitution is a consensus document, but if there is a redeeming factor about it, it is a living document, right? By virtue of being a living document, you can keep on amending, changing whatever is there, and improve upon it. But right now, as was pointed out by the regarding the mandate of caretaker setup, that is there, and it is quite clear. But then there is another example that I read the other day when I actually cited the constitution itself regarding census, that once the census results are notified, then delimitation have to take place. An election commission has to actually incorporate that into the next election also. Now the question is, why is it that visibly two clauses of the constitution clashing with each other, right? With that kind of circumstances in mind, my only problem is that in the past 14 months or whatever time we saw, we have seen a special presentation or example, a long list of examples of how the constitution keeps on contradicting itself. The simple thing is, if there is a caretaker setup, and if there is a question once it arises regarding what happens if it has to be extended, shouldn't there be language in the constitution that actually takes care of that? Now, remember that any constitution or per se any national document is the reflection of collective imagination of the people, their aspirations as well. And that's why the biggest concern right now is that our national discourse keeps on obsessing about few things but doesn't take into cognizance other aspects. For example, in Punjab and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, you have seen that when assemblies were dissolved, at that time there was insistence that elections be held on a specific time. But how do you actually go about doing it, right? You need security, and there was a demand for something like 300,000 army men, right, in Punjab alone. Now the question is, why is it that constitution does not answer what happens if army cannot provide soldiers at least for piecemeal elections, right? The army says that the only reason the only clarification we needed at that time was that we have never refused to provide the soldiers or personnel. The concern right now is that it can be done because the army is deployed on the border areas. We can pull it out for once, but if you ask us to keep on doing it after 4 months, 8 months periodically, that becomes really difficult. So just ensure that elections take place on Monday. Again, it is a very rational demand, because then Punjab is the most populous province of the country. If the elections take place there first, it ensures that the sitting chief minister will have an influence on the outcome of the national elections in the province. And mind you, that the population of almost the majority of National Assembly is defined by Punjab. Why is it that the constitution is silent on that kind of a possibility? Why can't constitution tell us that elections of all units have to take place on the same day, right? With that kind of questions, now the problem is that I'm concerned about people who are obsessed about a bit or a part of the constitution, but forget the general sense of democracy or of constitutionalism. We kept on obsessing about holding elections on a specific day, and we kept on talking about Supreme Court's role. Amazingly, the Supreme Court that was insisting that elections be held in Punjab was silent on Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. Right. Are they our step cousins or step brothers? No, they are not. They are our brothers, right? They are entitled to similar kind of rights. Yeah. So the humble summation that I want to give you is, whatever will happen will happen. This country has seen martial laws, this country has seen hybrid regimes, it has seen attempts to actually consolidate under civilian dictatorships as well. But in the end, the question regarding the date, timing, and all these issues should be answered by the Constitution, which is supreme. And the only way to do it is to ensure that our politicians keep on paying attention. They don't seem to be paying attention, otherwise we would have never ended up with this in this thick soup.
Right, and we'll talk more about that. But Faisal, I also want to focus on this particular choice also, because it's of course important in terms of who it is that's going to lead the caretaker setup. And I want to understand, especially in terms of the timeline that is there, whether or not there can be possibly any sort of consensus. Of course, there have been some sort of talks that were already underway, and of course discussions would have already taken place on a lot of fronts. I want to know whether or not in the next 3 days or so the consensus can actually come up with a particular name. And then I also want to understand what exactly is your perception in terms of the factors that are being considered when we talk about this choice by the different political parties.
And I just wanted to point out that Faisal might be the perfect man to actually answer that question, because I can see two names, Raja Faisal, and then I look at the other screen and there's opposition leader's name is Raja Riaz. So there might be some connection or relation. Please go ahead.
Yes, Sana, thank you very much. You know, if we currently look at the situation, of course, the premier problem which was faced by Pakistan in recent past, of course, it was the economy, as I have earlier mentioned. And I think things are being looked into, looking at the economy. That is why in recent days we have been highlighting time and again the names which are always echoed about our economy. Like we talked about Hafiz Sheikh, like we talked about certain of the names that are always echoed for the economic setup of Pakistan. So that is what I was thinking about. But currently, of course, we are hearing about other names as well. Other names that are very important names. Of course, one of the names which if we take, of course, that would be of Jilani Saab. Jilani Saab.
Which Jilani Saab? The elder one or the younger one?
I forgot the first name.
Tasadduq Jilani and Jalil Abbas Jilani.
Yeah, Jalil Abbas Jilani. He has obviously served Pakistan's foreign office, and he has served brilliantly. He is someone who is considered a pro on Pakistan's foreign policy. We of course need someone who can steer us out from obviously there are lots of things which are going on in globally, and we have to look at that as well. Of course, I'm talking about the Ukrainian crisis. Of course, I'm talking about the many other things which are taking place in the region as well. That is quite important, and with them, of course, we can see that the name of Hafiz Sheikh, if not Prime Minister, then of course one of the important slots of the cabinet, he might secure that in future. Coming to the science of how would it happen, the 3 days, will there be a consensus from within the political parties? I believe that there will be a consensus, because the names which are echoing around, they are being well thought of, and they are well thought about as well. And I think since the debate generated about the interim setup, political parties were already gossiping around it, and the names they will come up with, they would already be agreed upon by a majority. And as Farrukh Bhai has just highlighted that of course we have to be considering Raja Riaz as well, because he is opposition leader.
Yeah. Might have told you something.
Yes, he will be playing a pivotal role when it comes to acceptance of the name. If that acceptance is not reached, then of course, as Barrister Shabbir, he has rightly pointed out that they will be going to the next phase for 3 more days. And even in past, we have sort of a precedent which was set by once again Raja Pervez Ashraf when he was Prime Minister at that time. He, if I'm not wrong, for 2 weeks he remained as a Prime Minister until we had the interim setup in place. So we have that kind of situation where there will be acceptable name coming very soon, but if not so, then of course we have the precedents which could be followed in coming days. But eventually we will be having a person that is quite concerned about, of course, looking into our foreign policy issues plus our economic issues as well, and that these two domains are going to be the pivotal when it comes to who comes in the office and who doesn't.
Right, absolutely. And let me just check if we have Barrister Shabbir with us. Barrister Shabbir, can you hear me? Barrister Saab, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
All right. My question now is also in terms of when we talk about the conduct of free and fair elections, something, of course, that we have been wanting in the country for quite some time. And this is important, especially in terms of now the involvement of the caretaker setup, which is more empowered than before. And I want to know that one basic understanding of the caretaker setup, of course, is that it will foster the conduct of free and fair elections. And whether or not there is a challenge or any sort of contradiction or a hindrance to that now that the setup is more empowered. And then also add to that whether or not, even if we look at any possible consensus or the parliamentary committee deciding somebody or the ECP deciding somebody, whether or not there can be a guarantee of the kind of objectivity that is required from the caretaker setup for the conduct of free and fair elections, and whether inherently there is some sort of measure that is part of the system that doesn't allow for any sort of subjectivity from the persons involved in the caretaker setup. How's that ensured, not just in terms of the basis of how the choice is made, but also in terms of the conduct of the government?
Sana, let me answer your previous question and one that was just commented upon by the learned colleague and their fellow guest. Article 224A subclause 4 specifically states that until a caretaker prime minister or a chief minister is appointed, the incumbent in the office shall continue to hold office. So for any reason, even God forbid, if the 8th day period is not, a timeline is not followed, the 224A4 is a specific clause which says that the Prime Minister shall continue in office.
All right.
That's one point I wanted to make. The other point, with your permission, Pitafi Saab, with respect, had pointed out, and I want to compliment him on his understanding of the Constitution. He is absolutely correct on stating that Constitution is a living document. That is correct, and this is what the Supreme Court says also. Where my learned friend says that why cannot it be that the provinces or the National Assembly, their elections, if they are dissolved, the assemblies are dissolved, they should take place on the same day. You see, the Constitution specifically holds and states otherwise. It says and it allows, as in the case of Punjab Assembly, and that debate is old enough now. But it does not really matter. If I may even agree with him that the elections, if it were up to me, should take place on the same day. But it does not matter what I think or he thinks or any one of us thinks. What matters is what people of Pakistan collectively, what have they decided? And they have decided through the Constitution that if situation so arises, which it did, then elections can take place and should take place on different dates of different assemblies. And that, until and unless that is amended, sadly, we can't do anything about it. And in fact, the Supreme Court has decided that straightforward. Now, it is another matter that the decision of the Supreme Court is not being implemented. The recent question that you asked me, there is one very important provision with the caretaker regulation itself, which I wanted to comment upon and point out to you. You asked on the fairness of the caretaker system and how is it that it could be ensured that the general elections are held in a fair and transparent manner. Number one, the duty to hold free and fair elections vests on the Election Commission of Pakistan,
Right.
which is an independent body, which has extremely wide powers. And let's hope in the future it becomes independent when it comes to financial autonomy as well, which it is not at present. So the duty to hold free and fair elections vests with the Election Commission of Pakistan, not with the caretaker government. Yes, the
I understand that, Barrister Sahab, but I want to also then understand whether or not that has been the case in the past, and whether or not the kind of authority that perhaps rests on the ECP is that actually exercised in terms of what has happened, and how exactly now the empowered caretaker setup will be doing that moving forward as well. Do you think that there can be no possible friction between these two entities, and hasn't been in the past?
You see, both there could be fractions, but what matters and what depends on the powers given to both different bodies. The Prime Minister, of course, even if the caretaker Prime Minister is the Prime Minister of Pakistan, he is the executive head of the state, and he has almost all the same powers. However, the only difficulty is that there is a Supreme Court judgment. They can only take decisions which are day-to-day matters. They cannot take policy decisions. So their powers are curtailed to that extent. But insofar as the powers of a Prime Minister are concerned, they are there. But during the elections, the Election Commission of Pakistan has an extraordinary power of transfer and posting as well. So if the IG of police is there, the Election Commission can virtually also exercise these powers. And once an election schedule is announced, the transfer and postings are prevented and prohibited. So they are very wide powers.
Can you please correct me, because I think, and I may be wrong, but I think I have an understanding of whether or not that power was amended a bit in the recent bill that was passed, and was added to the caretaker setup. Was that done or not?
I would have to examine the provision. Forgive me, I don't have the specific amendment in front of me. So so excuse me on that. I don't have that amendment, and I've not gone through it. If any additional powers are vested with the Election Commission, but there are even according to the previous act and supported by judgments of the courts, this power vests with the Election Commission. And once the election schedule is announced, if a transfer is made, such transfer is most often declared as illegal by the courts if the matter is taken to the court. Now, before I forget, one point I wanted to clarify. Which will come back to your question as to how the caretaker setup and how the Constitution ensures that the caretaker setup also remains neutral. You see, there is one clause which states that the caretaker Prime Minister or the Chief Minister, or that any member of the caretaker cabinets, they cannot contest elections, number one, themselves. And number two, their immediate family members also cannot take part in elections. So that's although I mean it should have been wider, but immediate family members are also defined as spouse and the children.
Right. So right, and that is true. Sana, very quickly, I just wanted to clarify your question regarding the new powers that are vested with the caretaker setup.
Yes.
I believe that those amendments that actually took place were particularly about financial dealings, right? International obligations, various international accords that the country signs, and according to that, you can actually sign some documents and follow through, which actually goes beyond your own mandate, that is 3 months or whatever time that might be, right?
Okay.
So executive powers, other powers that are with the Election Commission, and they actually automatically transfer to that, I don't think they have been taken back.
Okay,
Yeah, Sana,
I still think I read somewhere about the transfers, but of course I'll check again and come back to this discussion.
Sana,
Yes, Faisal.
Sana, I have a very innocent type of question
All right.
to ask from Barrister Shabbir. Barrister Shabbir, if there is, supposedly, if there is a situation in which, I mean, currently, of course, we know that Prime Minister Sharif, he categorically said last week that he is expecting the elections to be in time, but ball is in the court of Election Commission of Pakistan. And now, if let's suppose ECP is faced with a situation in which it is not feasible for them practically to hold the election in time as in accordance to the constitution, as they are required to do and bound to do that. But if they come up with obviously the solution in terms of terming it as extraordinary situation, as we have earlier mentioned, and they propose a new date which is of course beyond the 90 days as we have discussed earlier, and they propose it to all of the all of the contesting parties, the political parties I'm talking about, and majority of the parties agree with the ECP that yes, you're right, it is not physically possible to hold election now. And if the majority of the contesting parties are agreeing to it, can we say that ECP can get a waiver from not going against the constitution of Pakistan in that sense?
Raja Saab, if I were to be very candid with you, I'm afraid the answer that you seek is not available in the form of an affirmative answer. Because previously also, to me, as a constitutionalist, if you ask me, it's a fraud on the constitution. There cannot be any justification for something like this. To me, it's black and white. And if we were to search for something which hasn't even an eventuality which hasn't even arisen as yet, and we have started debating as to what if in 90 days we are not to do it, how long can we get? Yes, you can get as long as 10 years, 20 years, but there is no constitutional justification. It would be illegal. That's it. It will be unconstitutional. Fine. We want to live with it. We can live with it for 10 years, 20 years, but there cannot be a rubber stamp on it that fine, you can do it, and this is justified. Because if we justify it once, then imagine after 5 years you would be giving way to another such eventuality. So fine, you want to do it, but at least don't ask कि इसको constitutional एक stamp लगाएं. So I think that would be making it two wrongs.
So doctrine of necessity should not be applied here, is it?
Has been
especially when it doesn't serve your purpose.
Yeah.
Thank God we've done away with doctrine of necessity. Good riddance.
Right, absolutely.
I really hope that we have.
Thank you very much, Barrister Shabbir, for joining us and being a part of the discussion.
May I say one thing, Sana?
Yes.
Thank you. I want to compliment PTV and you in particular, and also your colleagues, because there is a misunderstanding and misnomer, which is that on PTV in particular, they don't allow free speech. But I want to compliment you that whenever I've spoken, I'm allowed to speak independently, and not for once. You have taken me on the show so many times. My compliments, because this is
Thank you very much.
Before
Barrister Saab leaves.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Sana, thank you very much, Barrister Saab. And before you leave, I don't want you to leave with a wrong impression. When I was talking about, holding the elections on the same day, at that time it wasn't my opinion. I was citing an opinion that came from certain quarters. And I just pointed out that with all those demands or those contradictions, there should be a law to actually answer those questions. So that was my point. I don't have any opinion on that.
Always. Thank you.
And Barrister Shabbir, whatever my questions were, they were owing to the fact that whatever happened in 1 year, last year, regarding the provincial assemblies, of course, we have to look into that as well. And that's why we created the situation to create the questions to pose you.
Right. Thank you very much, Barrister Shabbir, for joining us. It's always a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
have you. Thank you very much, Farrukh and Faisal, for also being part of
You
the
don't want
discussion.
me to add to this?
Absolutely. Go ahead, and we have about 30 seconds if you want to.
Yeah, thank you very
Yes.
much. I'll become the 30-second man.
Yes.
Right. So the aspects that I wanted to actually clarify whenever we talk about Supreme Court and its judgments, let me remind everybody that it is Supreme Court of Pakistan that rubber stamped most of the military takeovers in this country as well, and so many other shoddy arrangements as well. And similarly, when you talk about doctrine of necessity, I don't think it is gone. I think it has been in the shape of what was happening in Punjab and the way Supreme Court usurped the right of Lahore High Court when it was hearing a case. At that time also, it was doctrine of necessity that actually governed. And in the end, when they actually reduced the bench to only those people that Chief Justice, Honorable Chief Justice of Pakistan could trust, that was also doctrine of necessity. That has never gone. The only thing is, if it doesn't serve me, then I actually call it doctrine of necessity. When it serves me, I'd say that it has been buried.
Right, absolutely. Thank you very much, Farrukh. Thank you, Faisal, for joining us and being part of the discussion. As always, that's all that we have from the show. See you tomorrow.